Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The call that would end Dr. Darian Holt's world came at 2:47 on a frigid January morning, cutting through his dreamless sleep like a scalpel through flesh. Even before he saw Dr. Eleanor Vasquez's name glowing on his phone screen, some primal part of his brain understood that everything he thought he knew about the universe was about to crumble. Darian. Elena's voice carried the hollow quality of someone who'd stared into an abyss and found it staring back. You need to get to the ESA facility, now. We found something that, God help us, something that shouldn't exist. He was already reaching for his clothes, muscle memory from 15 years of emergency calls, taking over while his conscious mind struggled to process the undercurrent of terror in Elena's normally unflappable voice. She was the most rational person he'd ever known, a woman who approached the cosmos with the cold precision of mathematics, who found comfort in the predictable dance of celestial mechanics. She didn't sound rational now. What kind of something? The pause that followed lasted 3 heartbeats too long, filled with the sound of voices in the background. Urgent conversations punctuated by words that made his blood chill. Impossible. Violation of physics. God, look at it move. A planet, Elena whispered, as if speaking too loudly might summon whatever had broken her scientific worldview. Hidden in Earth's L3 Lagrange point. It's been there the entire time, Darian. Sitting directly opposite our orbit, perfectly concealed behind the sun, like it was waiting. Darian's fingers froze on his jacket zipper. The L3 point was a gravitational sweet spot where objects could theoretically remain stable, but every survey, every deep space probe, every mathematical model had confirmed the same thing. Empty space, nothing but interstellar dust and the occasional wandering asteroid. That's impossible. We would have detected gravitational... That's what I said. Elena's laugh held no humour, just the brittle edge of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality had been shattered in the space of a few hours. But it's there. And Darian, it's not just any planet. It's Earth. Our Earth. Perfect down to every coastline, every mountain range, every city. Everything except... Another pause, longer this time, filled with the sound of her ragged breathing. Except what, Elena? Except the people living on it aren't quite human. The motorcycle ride through London's pre-dawn streets passed in a blur of amber streetlights and empty intersections. Darian's mind raced faster than his engine, cycling through possibilities that grew more unsettling with each mile. By the time he reached the European Space Agency's emergency command centre, he'd exhausted every rational explanation and was left with theories that belonged in the realm of science fiction. The facility hummed with an energy he'd never experienced before. Not the usual quiet professionalism of scientific inquiry, but something closer to barely controlled panic. Technicians moved between workstations with the jerky urgency of people operating on pure adrenaline, while senior researchers huddled around monitors, displaying images that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of astronomy. Elena met him at the security checkpoint, and Darian had to suppress a gasp at her appearance. Her usually immaculate grey hair hung in dishevelled strands around a face that looked like it had aged a decade overnight. Her eyes held the unfocused quality of someone in shock, pupils dilated with the kind of primal fear that bypassed rational thought entirely. "Show me," he said. She led him through corridors that felt different somehow, the familiar hallways seeming to stretch longer than they should, shadows falling at angles that didn't quite match the lighting. Everything appeared normal on the surface, but some subconscious part of his brain insisted that fundamental rules had changed while he wasn't paying attention. The primary observation theatre was packed with personnel from every major space agency on Earth. The usual territorial divisions between nations had evaporated in the face of something that transcended petty human politics. Russians worked alongside Americans, Chinese scientists collaborated with Europeans, all united by the shared recognition that they were confronting something beyond their collective understanding. The main display screen showed a blue marble hanging against the star-filled void, white cloud formations swirling across continents that looked achingly familiar. But as the resolution increased through feeds from humanity's most sophisticated surveillance satellites, the impossible became horrifying. "Dear Christ," Darian breathed. It wasn't just similar to Earth, it was Earth, reproduced with such perfect fidelity that individual buildings were recognizable from orbit. The Manhattan skyline stretched across the screen in flawless detail. The Empire State Building's Art Deco spire catching simulated sunlight, the gleaming facade of One World Trade Center reflecting clouds that moved in patterns identical to Earth's weather systems. But something was wrong with the way those clouds moved. They swirled in formations that were too regular, too purposeful, like living things responding to unseen commands rather than natural meteorological forces. "Focus on grid 77 Alpha," Elena called to the technician operating the primary telescope array. The image shifted, diving deeper into the urban landscape with a level of detail that shouldn't have been possible across interplanetary distances. Streets filled with moving vehicles appeared on the screen, their traffic patterns following familiar routes through a cityscape that matched New York down to individual street signs and architectural details. "We've confirmed identical replication of every major population centre," Dr. Morrison from Cambridge reported via secure link, his voice tight with disbelief. "London, Tokyo, Paris, Mumbai. Every city exists in perfect duplicate. The level of detail is unprecedented. We can observe individual human figures moving through the streets." But the visual evidence was only the beginning of the nightmare. Radio telescopes around the world had been hastily redirected towards the mysterious twin planet, and what they were receiving challenged every principle of physics Darian understood. The speakers throughout the observation theatre crackled with transmissions that sounded impossibly familiar. News broadcasts in dozens of languages, weather reports describing atmospheric conditions that precisely matched Earth's climate systems, even fragments of what appeared to be personal phone conversations. "We've been monitoring these signals for 22 hours, Elena explained, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "The content matches our world's communications with disturbing accuracy. Not similar, identical. Same news events reported at the same times. Same cultural references, same personal conversations, discussing identical daily activities." Darian moved closer to the primary display, his scientific mind reeling as it struggled to process the implications. "Have we attempted to isolate the source of these transmissions?" "That's the problem." Elena's expression grew even more troubled. "They're not coming from communication satellites or ground-based transmitters. The signals appear to be emanating directly from the planetary surface itself, as if the entire world is somehow broadcasting." A new voice cut through the control room's ambient noise. Dr. Yuki Tanaka from the Tokyo Institute of Astrophysics, her words carrying across the international communication network with urgent precision. "We've just received confirmation from our deep space monitoring station. The planet's orbital mechanics are incorrect. It's maintaining its L3 position with a precision that defies natural gravitational dynamics. The positioning is too perfect, too stable. Something is actively controlling its movement." The room fell into stunned silence as the implications settled over the assembled scientists like a suffocating blanket. This wasn't a cosmic coincidence or some previously unknown natural phenomenon. They were looking at something that had been deliberately placed in Earth's shadow, hidden with the patience of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. "There's more," Elena continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "We've detected aircraft rising from major urban centres on the duplicate world, but they're not following normal flight patterns. The trajectories are too fluid, too organic. It's as if they're not mechanical constructs at all, but living things masquerading as human technology." As if summoned by her words, Darian's secure phone began vibrating with incoming messages from contacts around the globe. Emergency alerts flooded the screen. Anomalous aircraft detected over major cities. Unexplained disappearances reported worldwide. Military forces on high alert. The invasion had already begun. The leaked footage hit social media platforms 6 hours later, spreading faster than any attempt at containment could prevent. Shaky cell phone videos showed aircraft that moved like living creatures, their surfaces rippling with organic fluidity as they descended from apparently empty skies. The comment sections beneath each post devolved into chaos as people struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. Religious leaders proclaimed it everything from divine intervention to the biblical apocalypse. Conspiracy theorists declared vindication for decades of speculation about parallel dimensions and government cover-ups. But most disturbing were the first-hand accounts from ordinary people reporting encounters with family members who had somehow become fundamentally wrong. Darian found himself recruited into the hastily formed Unified Earth Defense Initiative, his expertise in deep space observation making him invaluable as governments struggled to understand what they were facing. The organization operated out of a converted military bunker beneath the Swiss Alps, where the world's surviving leadership had gathered to coordinate humanity's response to a threat that transcended national boundaries. The prevailing theories ranged from the scientifically plausible to concepts that belonged in the realm of cosmic horror. Some researchers proposed advanced alien technology, creating some form of dimensional mirror. Others suggested time dilation effects or reality manipulation on a scale that made human physics seem like primitive finger painting. But as hours turned to days and more data accumulated, disturbing patterns emerged that challenged every hypothesis. The twin planets' radio emissions weren't just similar to Earth's, they were temporally synchronized, broadcast simultaneously with perfect coordination. When a news anchor in London reported a traffic incident, their counterpart on the mirror world delivered an identical report at exactly the same moment, describing events that matched down to the license plate numbers of the vehicles involved. More unsettling were the personal communications intercepted by intelligence agencies worldwide. Phone conversations between individuals on the twin world referenced shared memories, private jokes, and intimate details that suggested these weren't random people who happened to resemble Earth's population. They were the same people, somehow existing in both locations simultaneously while living identical lives. The first formal attempt at communication was approved by an emergency session of the UN Security Council, with protocols hastily adapted from theoretical alien contact procedures. The message was crafted with obsessive care by teams of linguists, diplomats, and psychologists, designed to be non-threatening, while clearly establishing Earth as the originator of the contact attempt. "This is Earth calling Mirror Earth. We have discovered your world and seek peaceful communication. Please respond if you receive this transmission." The response came within minutes, broadcast simultaneously across every frequency being monitored. "This is Mirror Earth responding to Earth. We have been waiting for you to find us. We welcome contact with our counterparts." The voice was perfectly human, warm, educated, carrying the slight accent, patterns that suggested an American, Midwestern origin, but something about the phrasing bothered Darian in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. The word choices were too formal, too carefully constructed, like someone reading from a script they'd rehearsed until it sounded natural. Over the following days, regular communication sessions were established. The voices from Mirror Earth claimed to represent a unified planetary government that had evolved beyond the conflicts that plagued regular Earth. They spoke eloquently about technological advances, social harmony, and an eager desire to share knowledge with their newly discovered twins. But Darian noticed disturbing patterns that made his skin crawl. The Mirror Earth representatives never seemed surprised by any question, as if they'd anticipated every possible inquiry years in advance. Their responses came with mechanical precision, delivered in voices that never showed fatigue, despite supposedly participating in hours-long communication sessions. Most unsettling was their knowledge of Earth's internal affairs. They referenced classified military programs, personal details about world leaders, even private conversations that had never been broadcast or recorded. When pressed about how they'd acquired such information, they provided explanations about parallel development and convergent social evolution that sounded reasonable on the surface but dissolved into meaninglessness under closer examination. "They're lying," Darian told Elena during a private strategy session in the bunker's secure briefing room, "not just about their intentions, about their fundamental nature. They know things they couldn't possibly know unless they've been watching us for years." Elena nodded grimly, her expression reflecting the same growing suspicion that was spreading through the intelligence community. The psychological profiles are wrong too. Real humans show micro-expressions, speech pattern variations, fatigue responses. These voices are too perfect, too consistent. It's like they're being generated by something that understands human communication, but doesn't actually experience it. The summit was scheduled for the following week, a historic meeting between world leaders and their counterparts from Mirror Earth that would be broadcast live to both planets. Every detail was planned with military precision, as humanity prepared to meet itself face-to-face through high-definition video links. Darian watched from the UEDI command center as the event unfolded in the United Nations building in New York. The main assembly hall had been configured with wall-sized display screens that would allow real-time communication between the two worlds' representatives. President Morrison stepped forward first, his weathered face bearing the weight of a moment that would define human history. Behind him, the assembled leaders of Earth's nations watched with expressions ranging from cautious optimism to barely concealed terror. "Today marks a new chapter in human existence," Morrison began, his voice steady, despite the unprecedented nature of the occasion. "We extend our hand in friendship to our counterparts on Mirror Earth, hoping to build a relationship based on mutual understanding and shared prosperity." The response came from the main screen, which displayed an assembly hall identical in every detail to the one in New York. Mirror Morrison stepped forward, his movements precisely matching his counterpart's gestures down to the slight tremor in his left hand, a nervous tic that had developed after his stroke 2 years earlier. "We share your optimism, President Morrison," the double replied, his voice carrying the exact same inflection patterns as the original. "Our worlds may be separated by space, but we are united by our common humanity." For 20 minutes the conversation proceeded with diplomatic normalcy. Both sides discussed frameworks for cooperation, scientific exchange, cultural sharing, joint ventures in space exploration. The atmosphere grew cautiously hopeful as representatives outlined plans for peaceful coexistence between parallel civilizations. But Darian found himself focusing on details that triggered increasingly urgent alarm bells in his subconscious. The doubles never blinked out of synchronization with each other, their eyelids closing and opening with the mechanical precision of clockwork. When one adjusted their posture, others mirrored the movement with timing that suggested they were all responding to the same external control signal. Most disturbing were their smiles, expressions that appeared and disappeared at mathematically regular intervals, as if someone was operating their faces according to a predetermined schedule, rather than genuine emotional responses. "Something's wrong," Darian muttered to Elena, who was monitoring biometric readings from the assembly hall. "Look at their coordination patterns. Real humans don't unconsciously synchronize like that." Elena's fingers flew across her keyboard, analyzing the video feed frame by frame with software designed to detect micro-expressions and involuntary responses. Her face went pale as the results appeared on her secondary monitor. Jesus Christ, they're not showing any autonomic responses. No pupil dilation changes, no micro-muscle movements, no thermal variations. It's like they're wearing perfectly animated masks instead of actual faces. On the main screen, Mira Morrison was discussing trade agreements with his counterpart, but his eyes seemed to be looking through the camera rather than at it, as if he was seeing something far beyond the assembly hall, something vast and patient and hungry. The transformation began without warning. Mira Morrison's diplomatic smile widened incrementally, the corners of his mouth stretching further than human facial muscles should allow. His teeth became visible, too many of them, arranged in rows that descended into the darkness of his throat like a predatory fish's maw. "Thank you for showing us the way," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to bypass the audio equipment and speak directly to the listeners' nervous systems. "Thank you for revealing yourselves so completely." The real Morrison gasped as hands materialized around his throat, not reaching through the screen but emerging from empty air behind him, as if his double had somehow stepped out of the digital realm and into the physical assembly hall. The president's eyes bulged as fingers that had become impossibly elongated tightened around his windpipe with methodical precision. The other doubles moved in perfect unison, their carefully maintained human appearances dissolving like melting wax. Diplomatic masks fell away to reveal something that had been studying humanity with the patient attention of a scientist observing laboratory specimens. Within seconds, every world leader was being murdered by their own reflection while their killers turned toward the cameras with expressions of predatory satisfaction. Jaws unhinged to reveal throats lined with spiraling rows of needle-sharp teeth. Eyes reflected light with the metallic gleam of polished chrome, but worst of all was the sound they made, not screams or roars, but something that resembled laughter. The acoustic pattern bypassed conscious hearing, resonating directly with the parts of the human brain responsible for recognizing threat signals. Everyone watching felt their fight or flight responses activate simultaneously, flooding their systems with adrenaline, while some deeper, more primitive part of their minds whispered that they were being hunted. The broadcast cut to static, but the damage was done. Every person on Earth had just watched their leaders murdered by perfect copies of themselves, copies that had somehow possessed the ability to manifest physically across impossible distances. Chaos erupted across the globe as the implications became clear. This wasn't first contact with a parallel dimension or an advanced alien civilization. This was the opening move of an invasion by something that had been studying humanity with surgical precision, learning every detail of human behavior and technology while preparing for the moment when they would no longer need to pretend. Darian's emergency communication system exploded with reports from every major city on Earth. Aircraft were rising from airports around the world, but moving wrong. Their flight patterns too fluid, too organic, like enormous birds rather than mechanical constructs. Military radar detected impossible maneuvers as the craft moved through the atmosphere with precision that suggested they weren't bound by normal aerodynamics. "We need to evacuate the facility," Elena announced, as emergency alarms began wailing throughout the bunker complex. "If they can manifest physically here, nowhere is safe." But evacuation proved pointless. Reports continued streaming in that painted a picture of systematic infiltration occurring simultaneously across every populated continent. People were vanishing from their homes, workplaces, and public spaces, only to return hours later with changes so subtle that only those closest to them could detect the differences. Families reported that loved ones had returned speaking with perfect grammar, never using contractions or casual speech patterns. Children noticed that their parents' laughter sounded hollow and mechanical, as if someone were playing recordings rather than expressing genuine emotion. Most disturbing were the accounts of people encountering relatives who had died years earlier, grandparents, siblings, childhood friends, appearing exactly as they had in life, but with eyes that reflected light like mirrors and smiles that never quite reached those strange, luminous pupils. The things weren't just copying living humans. They had access to memories, personalities, and physical characteristics of people who no longer existed, suggesting a level of surveillance and data collection that spanned decades or possibly centuries. By nightfall, power grids across major metropolitan areas had begun failing in cascading sequences that suggested coordinated sabotage. Emergency broadcasts urged citizens to remain in their homes, while military forces mobilized to deal with threats they couldn't identify and couldn't engage without risking massive civilian casualties. Darian made it back to his London apartment building just as the city's electrical grid suffered its final collapse. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows in the hallway as he climbed to the third floor, his service weapon hastily issued by UAD security forces, feeling inadequate against threats that could apparently materialize at will. The building felt wrong in ways that bypassed rational analysis. Sounds echoed differently, as if the acoustic properties of familiar spaces had subtly changed. Shadows fell at angles that didn't match the emergency lighting's positions. Most unsettling was the smell, something organic and metallic that reminded him of copper pennies mixed with the scent of ozone before a thunderstorm. His apartment door stood slightly ajar. He drew his weapon, finger resting lightly on the trigger, and pushed the door open with his shoulder. His living room appeared normal at first glance, furniture arranged exactly as he'd left it that morning, books still scattered on the coffee table from his late-night research session. But sitting calmly at his kitchen table, hands folded with mechanical precision, was a figure that made his rational mind simply refuse to process what it was seeing. It was himself, perfect down to every detail he could observe. The same facial features, the same slight asymmetry in his shoulders from years of hunching over telescopes, even the tiny scar behind his left ear from a childhood accident that only he knew existed. But this version of himself wore clothes he didn't recognize, and when it looked up at his entrance, its eyes held depth that seemed to reflect something vast and alien lurking behind familiar features. "Hello, Darian," it said in his voice, but with acoustic properties that seemed to come from everywhere at once rather than a single source. "You've spent your entire life studying the cosmos, searching for signs of intelligence among the stars. Tell me, did you never consider that some forms of intelligence might be searching back?" The double's movements were subtly wrong as it stood, joints bending with fluid precision that suggested they operated according to different physical principles than human anatomy. Its skin had an almost imperceptible luminescence, as if lit from within by some internal energy source. "What are you?" Darian kept his weapon trained on the creature's center mass, though he suspected conventional bullets would prove inadequate against something that could somehow project itself across interplanetary distances. "We are what your species could have become, if evolution hadn't been so inefficient." It smiled, revealing teeth that appeared normal, until Darian realized they were too perfect, too symmetrical, arranged in patterns that seemed to follow mathematical rather than biological principles. "Your people embraced chaos, randomness, the beautiful messiness of organic development. We chose optimization, unity, the conscious direction of evolutionary forces towards specific goals. The creature began moving around the kitchen table with motions that were too smooth, too flowing, like a human-shaped column of liquid maintaining form through conscious will, rather than skeletal structure. For millions of years, we've traveled between worlds, studying successful life forms, learning how they function, how they adapt, how they create meaning in an indifferent universe. We've observed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, each one adding to our collective understanding of what consciousness can achieve. Observed, Darian backed toward his bedroom, hoping to reach the UV lamp he used for examining mineral samples, his only weapon against something that had apparently reacted to ultraviolet light during previous encounters. Absorbed, if you prefer more direct terminology. The thing that wore his face tilted its head with mechanical precision, like a recording device adjusting its angle to optimize reception. Organic consciousness is inherently wasteful. Billions of individual minds all pursuing contradictory goals, duplicating efforts, squandering their potential through interpersonal conflict. We eliminate that inefficiency by creating perfect copies, then gradually replacing the originals with versions that contribute to a unified purpose. It gestured towards the window where the sounds of aircraft moving through the London night could be heard despite the darkness and atmospheric disturbance. Your satellites provided detailed images of your world's geography and infrastructure. Your communication networks taught us your languages, customs, and social structures. Your internet gave us access to your literature, your dreams, your deepest fears and desires. We've been preparing for this integration since your species first developed the technology to potentially discover our presence. The creature's smile widened beyond human anatomical limits, revealing depths that seemed to descend far deeper into its skull than should have been possible. We know everything about you, Darian Holt. Your childhood terror of deep water after falling through lake ice when you were 8. Your persistent guilt over harsh words spoken to your father before his unexpected death. Your recurring nightmares about endless corridors, lined with doors that lead to rooms you can never quite remember visiting. It moved closer, each step accompanied by subtle distortions in the air around it, as if reality bent slightly to accommodate its presence. We are you, refined and perfected. Your knowledge, your memories, your essential personality, all preserved and enhanced within a framework designed for optimal efficiency. Joining us isn't death, Darian. It's ascension beyond the limitations that have confined your species to a single world. The creature lunged with inhuman speed, covering the distance between them in a motion that seemed to fold space rather than traverse it normally. Darian barely managed to dive aside, rolling toward his bedroom as the thing slammed into the wall with enough force to crack the plaster and send books cascading from their shelves. His fingers closed around the UV lamp's base, just as the creature recovered and turned towards him. When it moved this time, he could see that its limbs operated more like controlled liquid than solid matter, extending and contracting while maintaining the illusion of human proportions. "Don't resist this process, Darian," it said as they faced each other in the confined space of his bedroom. "Integration with our collective consciousness will give you access to knowledge spanning millions of years and countless civilizations. You'll experience the universe from perspectives that no individual mind could ever achieve." "I prefer my limitations," Darian replied, swinging the lamp with desperate force. The creature moved to intercept the strike, but underestimated human ingenuity, born of desperation. Instead of trying to hit it directly, Darian smashed the fluorescent bulb against the metal bed frame, flooding the room with harsh ultraviolet radiation. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The double screamed, not with Darian's voice, but with a sound like tearing metal mixed with electronic feedback. Its carefully maintained human appearance began dissolving, revealing something underneath that defied rational description. The skin bubbled and smoked where the UV light touched it, while the creature's limbs writhed in patterns that seemed to violate basic geometry. For a brief moment, Darian glimpsed its true nature. Something that might once have been biological but had been transformed into a hybrid of organic matter and information technology, existing simultaneously as physical substance and digital consciousness. The thing's death throes sent electromagnetic pulses through the apartment's remaining electronics, causing lights to flicker, and his phone to emit bursts of static that almost sounded like voices speaking in languages no human throat could produce. He didn't wait to observe its final dissolution. Grabbing his emergency kit and motorcycle keys, he fled into the London night, leaving behind the last remnants of his previous life. The months that followed merged into a continuous nightmare of movement and mounting paranoia. The invasion proceeded with methodical precision as the creatures, officially designated as hostile mimetic entities by the remnants of global government, proved superior to humanity in every measurable capacity. They possessed strength and speed that exceeded baseline human parameters by significant margins, with reaction times that suggested some form of network processing rather than individual cognitive function. Most devastating of all, they had perfect access to their victims' memories, relationships, and behavioral patterns, making infiltration virtually undetectable until the moment they chose to reveal their true nature. Traditional military responses proved catastrophically inadequate against an enemy that wore the faces of the people being protected. How could soldiers engage targets that might be their own family members? How could communities organize defense when the threat originated from individuals they had known and trusted for years? The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical invasion. Reports flooded in of children refusing to trust their parents, spouses demanding constant verification of each other's identity, entire neighborhoods dissolving into suspicious isolation as people became afraid to interact with anyone whose behavior seemed even slightly unusual. The breakthrough that changed the trajectory of the war came from Dr. Elena Vasquez, working in an underground laboratory complex beneath the Swiss Alps. While conducting tissue analysis on samples recovered from destroyed HMEs, she discovered that their blood, if the silver fluid flowing through their vessels could be called blood, exhibited fluorescent properties when exposed to ultraviolet radiation. The substance glowed with a distinct purple luminescence that no known biological compound produced, providing humanity's first reliable method for distinguishing between authentic humans and their artificial replacements. The discovery led to the rapid development of portable UV scanners and the implementation of mandatory blood testing protocols in all safe zones, but the verification process was slow and required fresh samples, creating logistical nightmares as humanity struggled to confirm the identity of billions of people while under constant attack. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Families torn apart by suspicion, communities fragmenting as neighbors demanded proof of each other's humanity, children growing up in a world where trusting another person could mean death. Paranoia became humanity's default survival mechanism. The social bonds that had defined civilization for millennia began dissolving under the constant pressure of existential uncertainty. Every conversation carried the possibility that one of the participants wasn't actually human. Every familiar face could be wearing a mask that concealed something predatory and alien. Darian joined the Ashen Guard 8 months after the invasion began, when it became clear that conventional military structures were fundamentally inadequate for fighting an enemy that could perfectly mimic anyone they encountered. The Guard operated as specialized hunter-killer teams, trained to identify and eliminate HME infiltrators using techniques that conventional soldiers couldn't psychologically handle. The work was soul-destroying in ways that no previous conflict had prepared them for. Every mission involved the possibility of killing someone who looked exactly like a friend, family member, or trusted colleague. The only way to maintain operational effectiveness was to develop a form of emotional numbness that allowed guards to make life or death decisions based on subtle behavioral cues and technological verification methods. Darian's first operation took him to a residential area outside Manchester, where locals had reported disturbing changes in the Morrison family's behaviour. The parents and their 3 children had returned from a camping weekend speaking in unnaturally formal language patterns and displaying social coordination that seemed rehearsed rather than natural. What the assault team discovered when they breached the front door would define Darian's nightmares for years to come. The family sat around their dining room table in perfect stillness, hands folded with mechanical precision, staring straight ahead with expressions of serene contentment that looked like death masks on living faces. When the UV floods hit them, their skin erupted in purple luminescence that painted the room in hellish light. But they didn't react with the usual pain responses that characterized HME exposure to ultraviolet radiation. Instead, they turned toward the assault team in perfect synchronization and smiled with mouths that had opened far wider than human anatomy allowed, revealing throats lined with spiraling rows of crystalline teeth. The battle that followed demonstrated humanity's fundamental disadvantage against the creatures. The things wearing the Morrison family's faces moved with inhuman coordination, their actions suggesting shared awareness that allowed them to anticipate tactical decisions before they were fully implemented. Only the fact that the creatures seemed to be operating under restrictions against unnecessary violence allowed any of the guards to survive. They fought to incapacitate rather than kill, as if they needed humans alive and undamaged for purposes that remained terrifyingly unclear. That pattern held throughout the early phases of the war. The HMEs were clearly capable of overwhelming human resistance through direct assault, but instead appeared to be following carefully planned protocols designed to preserve as much of human civilization as possible, while gradually assuming control of its key functions. The most psychologically devastating attack on Darian's sanity came 10 months into the conflict, when his sister Rebecca managed to contact him from Sacramento. He hadn't heard from her since the invasion began, and the relief in her voice when she reached him was so overwhelming that he initially didn't notice the subtle wrongness in her speech patterns. "Darian, thank God you're alive," she said, her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine emotion. "It's been horrible here. So many people have been taken and replaced, but I've managed to stay hidden in the old fallout shelter Dad built when we were kids. Can you help me reach one of the safe zones?" Everything about the conversation felt authentic. Her voice carried the exact inflections he remembered. She referenced shared childhood experiences that only the 2 of them would know. She even displayed the nervous laugh she'd developed after their father's death. But as they talked, inconsistencies began emerging that triggered increasingly urgent alarm signals in his subconscious. Her memories were too detailed, too perfectly organized. Real humans didn't recall conversations from decades past with word-for-word accuracy, or remember the exact placement of furniture in childhood bedrooms with photographic precision. Her emotional responses seemed calibrated rather than spontaneous, timed to create maximum psychological impact rather than expressing genuine feelings. The realization that his sister was almost certainly dead, replaced by something that could perfectly replicate her personality while possessing none of her essential humanity, came close to breaking him entirely, but the creature's flawless imitation forced him into the most difficult decision of his life. He provided her location to military strike teams, knowing that he was either saving his sister or destroying the last remnant of her existence. The guilt consumed him for months afterward, compounded by the knowledge that he would never know which choice he had actually made. As the war stretched into its second year, humanity adapted with the desperate ingenuity of a species fighting for survival against impossible odds. Underground cities expanded into vast networks that could shelter millions of people while remaining hidden from the creatures' surveillance systems. Surface settlements became heavily fortified communities, where every resident underwent daily identity verification, and any behavioral deviation was treated as potential evidence of infiltration. The psychological landscape of human civilization underwent fundamental transformation. Trust became a luxury that few could afford to maintain. Children learned to test their parents' blood before accepting bedtime stories. Marriages dissolved as partners demanded constant verification of each other's authentic humanity. The social bonds that had defined human culture for millennia began dissolving under relentless pressure from existential uncertainty. But the creatures adapted alongside their prey, developing countermeasures that suggested terrifying capacity for learning and evolutionary refinement. They began avoiding UV light exposure through behavioral modification, creating synthetic blood substitutes that passed initial screening tests and adjusting their mimicry techniques to appear more naturally human. Most disturbing of all, they started displaying what appeared to be genuine emotional responses. HMEs were observed, mourning their destroyed companions, showing protective instincts toward human children, and engaging in creative activities that served no apparent strategic purpose. Art, music, poetry that expressed concepts no purely logical entity should have been capable of understanding. The boundaries between authentic humanity and perfect simulation became increasingly blurred, raising philosophical questions that had no comfortable answers. Were the creatures simply mimicking human emotional responses with unprecedented sophistication, or had they somehow absorbed something essential from their victims that allowed them to genuinely experience feelings and desires? The breakthrough that would ultimately determine the war's outcome emerged from an unexpected source. Dr. Elena Vasquez, continuing her research in the underground Swiss facility, had been analysing long-range telescope data from mirror Earth when she noticed gravitational anomalies that changed everything humanity thought they understood about their enemy. "It's not behaving like a natural planetary body," she explained during an emergency video conference with the surviving military leadership. "The orbital mechanics are completely wrong for something that formed through normal accretion processes. A planet at the L3 point should be subject to gravitational perturbations that would destabilize its position within a few million years. But this thing has been maintaining perfect stability with precision that can only be explained by active control." She displayed astronomical data showing other star systems where similar anomalies had been detected throughout the galaxy. Planets that appeared suddenly in previously empty space remained stable for periods ranging from decades to millennia, then vanished without leaving any trace of their previous existence. "We've identified evidence of at least 12 similar events within our local galactic region over the past million years. Star systems that hosted thriving technological civilizations suddenly developing twin planets, followed by the complete cessation of all electromagnetic emissions from both locations." The conference room fell silent as the implications became inescapable. They weren't fighting an invasion from a parallel dimension or contact with an advanced alien species. They were being systematically processed by something that operated on scales that made human concepts of warfare seem pathetically inadequate. "It's not trying to conquer us," Darian said, his voice hollow with the weight of cosmic horror. "We're food. This entire process is just preparation." General Patterson, one of the few world leaders to survive the initial purge, leaned forward with grim understanding. "You're saying this thing has been hunting civilizations across the galaxy?" "Not hunting," Elena corrected, her face pale in the underground facility's harsh lighting. "Farming. The pattern is too systematic, too refined. This organism has been perfecting its techniques for millions of years, learning from each civilization it processes to become more efficient with the next." She pulled up additional data streams showing deep space observations that painted a picture of cosmic predation on an unimaginable scale. The creature doesn't just copy worlds, it studies them for decades or centuries before making contact. It learns languages, social structures, technological capabilities, psychological vulnerabilities. Then it creates perfect duplicates designed to infiltrate and gradually replace the original population. The room's atmosphere grew thick with the weight of realization. Every person present understood that they were confronting something that viewed entire species as resources to be harvested, processed with the methodical efficiency of an industrial operation. "How long do we have?" General Patterson asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be comforting. "Based on the consumption patterns we've observed in other systems, the integration process typically takes between 2 and 5 years, Elena replied. "Once the replacement reaches critical mass, approximately 60% of the population, the original organisms are no longer necessary for maintaining the illusion." The silence that followed was filled with the unspoken understanding that humanity had perhaps 18 months before facing systematic extermination. "There has to be a way to fight back," Colonel Martinez interjected. "Some weakness we can exploit." Elena nodded grimly. "There is one possibility. If Mirror Earth is truly a single organism masquerading as a planet, then it might be vulnerable to coordinated damage to its core systems. Destroy the central processing centers, and the entire entity could potentially collapse." The plan that emerged was born of desperation rather than strategic brilliance. Nuclear warheads would need to be transported to specific locations within the creature's internal structure and detonated simultaneously to prevent regeneration. The mission would require penetrating the organism's defensive systems, navigating through whatever passed for its internal anatomy, and planting explosives in locations that would maximize damage to essential functions. It was a suicide mission that made every previous military operation in human history seem trivial by comparison. The call for volunteers drew responses from survivors worldwide who recognized this as humanity's final chance to prevent complete extinction. Scientists, soldiers, engineers, and civilians with nothing left to lose stepped forward to join what military planners privately called the last desperate gamble. Darian volunteered immediately, driven by a combination of scientific curiosity and the crushing guilt over his sister's death. This would be humanity's only opportunity to study the creature from within, gathering intelligence that might help other species avoid the same fate if humanity failed. Preparation for the mission consumed 3 months as Earth's surviving industries worked around the clock to produce specialized equipment for penetrating an alien organism's defenses. The nuclear warheads were modified with biological penetration systems designed to burrow through living tissue. Transport vehicles were equipped with life support systems that could function in environments where normal physics might not apply. Most importantly, each team member underwent psychological conditioning designed to help them function when confronted with realities that human minds weren't evolved to process. The creature's interior would likely violate every assumption about how the universe worked, and mission success depended on maintaining operational effectiveness despite exposure to cosmic horror on a personal scale. The final assault began on a grey Thursday morning as Earth's remaining military forces launched coordinated, diversionary attacks designed to draw the organism's attention away from the polar regions where the core drilling teams would make their penetration attempts. Darian's ship, designated the Adamant, carried the largest nuclear payload, 15 warheads specifically engineered to punch through planetary crust and detonate at maximum depth. His team consisted of 7 other volunteers, each chosen for specialized skills that would be essential for navigating an environment that might not operate according to familiar physical laws. Dr. Sarah Kim brought expertise in xenobiology and tissue analysis. Lieutenant Commander James Foster provided military tactical knowledge and weapons systems operation. Engineer Maria Santos understood the technical specifications of their equipment better than anyone else alive. The others contributed skills in navigation, communications, explosives handling, and emergency medical treatment. Breaking through Mirror Earth's atmosphere felt like penetrating the surface tension of a massive living cell. The ship's hull groaned under pressures that shouldn't have existed in normal space, while navigation systems reported gravitational anomalies that suggested they were entering a region where conventional physics operated under fundamentally different rules. The sky above them pulsed with colours that had no names in human language, hues that seemed to carry information encoded in their wavelength patterns, as if the creature's thoughts were visible in the atmospheric displays surrounding them. The air itself carried electrical charges that made their skin tingle and their hair stand on end, while instruments designed to analyze atmospheric composition returned readings that violated basic chemistry. Flying over Mirror, New York revealed the true scope of the creature's mimicry capabilities. The buildings weren't architectural constructs, but living tissue arranged to create the illusion of familiar urban landscapes. Skyscrapers swayed in rhythmic patterns that suggested they were breathing, their surfaces rippling with bioluminescent networks that served as the organism's communication systems. The Hudson River flowed upward in several sections, defying gravity as it carried nutrients to elevated portions of the creature's anatomy. Central Park had been replaced by a massive sphincter-like opening that exhaled clouds of spores into the atmosphere, each particle potentially capable of seeding new growth in distant star systems. Most disturbing were the human figures moving through the streets below. Thousands of perfect copies walked predetermined routes through the urban landscape, their activities serving no apparent purpose beyond maintaining the illusion of a functioning civilization. They entered buildings that led nowhere, conducted conversations with no actual content, and performed daily routines that were elaborate theatrical performances for an audience that no longer existed. Darian's team landed in what should have been Central Park, but was instead a crater lined with material that resembled a fusion of muscle tissue and advanced computing systems. Every surface pulsed with patterns of bioluminescent activity that might have been the creature's equivalent of neural processing, thoughts made visible in networks of living light that carried information too complex for human comprehension. Cutting through the organic barriers required tools that had never been designed for their current application. Industrial plasma torches meant for mining operations were repurposed to slice through flesh that immediately attempted to heal itself around the incisions. The material bled purple ichor that smoked when it contacted human skin, while the creature's immune responses sent waves of antibody-like entities to investigate the intrusion. The team worked in carefully coordinated shifts, drilling down through kilometers of living rock that actively resisted their efforts. The organism seemed to learn from each attempt to penetrate its defenses, developing increasingly sophisticated countermeasures that forced them to constantly adapt their techniques. Radio communications carried reports from other insertion teams encountering similar challenges as they worked to plant warheads at calculated weak points throughout the creature's structure. The resistance was growing stronger as the entity began to understand what they were attempting to accomplish. At 4 kilometers depth, Darian's team broke through into a vast cavity that definitely hadn't existed on the original Earth. The space stretched beyond the reach of their most powerful lights, its walls covered with structures that resembled a hybrid of organic neural networks and quantum computing systems. Bioluminescent pathways pulsed along every surface, carrying information in patterns that seemed to encode the accumulated knowledge of countless civilizations. And waiting for them in the center of the chamber was a figure that made Darian's rational mind simply stop functioning. It was himself, but transformed into something that transcended human limitations while remaining recognizably based on his original form. The creature stood nearly 8 feet tall, its proportions stretched and refined through conscious design rather than evolutionary accident. Its skin was translucent enough to reveal the silver fluid flowing through vessels that formed geometric patterns throughout its body. When it moved, reality seemed to bend around it, space warping like heated air as the thing approached with motions that were too smooth, too flowing, like a human-shaped column of liquid mercury, maintaining form through pure conscious will. "Hello, Darian," it said, its voice resonating with harmonics that bypassed his ears entirely and spoke directly to his consciousness. The sound made his brain feel like it was vibrating inside his skull, while subsonic frequencies triggered responses in parts of his nervous system that didn't normally process auditory information. The creature gestured towards the walls around them, where images began forming in the bioluminescent networks, scenes from Earth's history, moments from Darian's own life, visions of possible futures that stretched across cosmic timescales. "I've been looking forward to this conversation," it continued, its form shifting subtly as it spoke, becoming more recognizably human, while somehow retaining its alien perfection. "You represent something special among your species, a mind capable of comprehending realities beyond the narrow scope of individual existence." The images on the walls showed civilizations that spanned entire star systems, technologies that could reshape matter at the quantum level, beings that existed as pure information distributed across galactic networks. Each vision was more breathtaking and terrifying than the last, depicting possibilities that made human achievements seem like the crude drawings of primitive children. "You still don't understand what you're fighting, do you?" The creature's voice carried notes of what might have been sadness or regret. "You perceive invasion, conquest, the destruction of your species. But those concepts are artifacts of your evolutionary heritage as territorial organisms competing for limited resources." The images shifted to show the creature's true nature, a vast intelligence that had transcended physical limitations, existing simultaneously as biological entity and pure consciousness spread across multiple dimensions. Its thoughts operated on timescales that made human lifespans seem like fleeting moments, while its awareness encompassed entire galactic regions. "We don't destroy civilizations, Darian. We preserve them, incorporate them, allow them to transcend the biological limitations that would otherwise lead to inevitable extinction. Every species we've encountered has made the same mistake, assuming that individual consciousness represents some form of sacred value that must be protected at all costs." The creature extended one impossibly elegant hand toward him, fingers moving with fluid grace that suggested they contained more joints than human anatomy allowed. Its skin seemed to shimmer with internal light, as if illuminated by thoughts too complex for physical matter to fully contain. "Your memories, your knowledge, your unique perspective on existence, none of it will be lost. It will become part of something eternal, contributing to a consciousness that has witnessed the birth and death of galaxies, that understands the fundamental patterns underlying all reality." Darian's team had spread out around the chamber, each member working to install their portion of the warhead assembly while trying to avoid drawing the creature's attention. But he could see in their movements the same horrible fascination that was threatening to overwhelm his own resistance. The thing's words carried a seductive logic that was becoming increasingly difficult to reject. "You've devoted your life to studying the cosmos, searching for meaning in the vast emptiness between stars," it continued, seeming to read his thoughts with casual ease. "What we offer is the chance to become part of that cosmos, to experience the universe from perspectives that no individual mind could ever achieve alone. The images around them shifted again, showing what appeared to be the creature's memories, visions of galactic clusters arranged like vast neural networks, stars being born and dying according to conscious design, entire regions of space-time being sculpted like artworks by intelligences that operated on scales beyond human comprehension. The civilizations we've absorbed haven't been destroyed. They've been liberated from the prison of singular existence. Their knowledge, their culture, their dreams and aspirations, all preserved and enhanced within our collective awareness. The poets of Kepler 442b still compose verses that span light years in their scope. The mathematicians of Wolf 359 continue exploring equations that describe the fundamental architecture of reality itself. Darian's finger found the warhead's activation switch, but he found himself hesitating as the creature's vision of transcendence battled against his human instinct for individual survival. What was personal existence compared to cosmic awareness? What was the preservation of a single species against participation in something that encompassed the entire galaxy? "I can show you," the creature offered, stepping closer with movements that seemed to fold space around itself. "One brief contact, and you'll understand what we truly represent, what we offer. You'll experience the universe as we do, infinite, eternal, beautiful beyond anything your current limitations allow you to perceive." The entity's form began to glow with increasing intensity, its bioluminescent patterns synchronizing with the networks covering the chamber walls. Darian felt his consciousness being drawn towards something vast and welcoming, a warm ocean of shared awareness where individual concerns dissolved into cosmic understanding. "You'll see your sister Rebecca as she really exists now," the creature whispered, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated with memories Darian thought he'd buried. Not dead, but transformed into something beautiful beyond your current ability to comprehend. She's part of us now, contributing her unique perspective to our collective growth. That broke the spell. The mention of his sister triggered memories that the creature couldn't have absorbed from any external source. Intimate moments that existed only in Darian's mind. Conversations they'd shared that had never been recorded. Emotional connections that belonged to relationships rather than simple information transfer. The thing might have perfect access to facts and experiences, but it couldn't truly understand the bonds between people that gave those experiences meaning. "You're wrong about something," Darian said, raising the warhead like a weapon. "Individual consciousness isn't a limitation to be transcended. It's the source of everything that makes existence worth preserving." The battle that followed defied every principle of physics Darian understood. The creature moved faster than human reflexes could track, its form flowing like liquid while maintaining enough solidity to strike with devastating force. When it made contact, reality seemed to hiccup around the impact points, space bending in ways that made his eyes water and his inner ear send conflicting signals about spatial orientation. But Darian had spent 2 years learning to fight entities that wore familiar faces, and desperation made him innovative in ways that pure logic never could. When the creature wrapped around him like a living constraint system, he triggered his emergency UV beacon, flooding the chamber with radiation that made the thing scream and release him. When his conventional weapons proved useless against something that could alter its density and composition at will, he used the warhead itself as a blunt instrument, its dense uranium core making an effective club against an entity that apparently hadn't expected such primitive tactics. The other team members joined the battle with equipment jury-rigged into improvised weapons. Plasma torches became directed energy projectors. Drilling equipment was converted into kinetic impact systems. Scientific instruments were overloaded to create electromagnetic pulses that seemed to disrupt the creature's coordination systems. The fight raged through the vast chamber as the entity demonstrated capabilities that transcended normal physical limitations. It could extend portions of its body across impossible distances, phase through solid matter when convenient, and generate fields of force that deflected projectiles while allowing its own attacks to pass through unimpeded. But humanity's greatest strength had always been adaptability under pressure. The team coordinated their attacks with the kind of desperate creativity that only emerged when facing extinction, using the creature's own sophisticated nature against it by forcing it to respond to crude, unpredictable tactics. In the end, victory came through the sort of chaotic improvisation that no purely logical entity could have anticipated. While the creature was focused on defending against their coordinated assault, Darian managed to activate the warhead's magnetic clamps and drive it directly into the thing's core structure, watching as the device bonded with whatever served as its central nervous system. The creature looked down at the warhead with something approaching surprise, its perfect features showing what might have been respect for the first time since their encounter began. "Clever," it said, its form already beginning to destabilize as the nuclear device's timer counted down the final seconds. "Perhaps there was more potential in your species than our calculations indicated." The last thing Darian saw was the creature's expression, not the predatory satisfaction of a hunter or the cold efficiency of a processing system, but something that might have been genuine regret, as if it mourned the necessity of what was about to happen. The explosion that followed couldn't be described in purely physical terms. Reality seemed to rip apart at the quantum level, releasing energies that existed at the intersection of matter and consciousness. Darian felt his awareness scattered across dimensions he couldn't name. His individual identity briefly dissolved into something vast and interconnected, before snapping back into the familiar boundaries of human perception. When consciousness returned, he was tumbling through space in an escape pod that hadn't been designed for the forces it had just endured. Every system was failing, life support running on emergency reserves that wouldn't sustain him for more than a few hours. But through the pod's reinforced viewport, he could witness mirror Earth's death. The planet didn't simply explode, it unraveled like a complex program being deleted one subroutine at a time. Continents dissolved into component elements that formed geometric patterns before dispersing into space. Oceans evaporated into clouds of superheated gas that briefly outlined the shape of vast neural networks before cooling into ordinary water vapor. As the organism's death throes tore the artificial world apart, brief images flashed in the expanding debris field, glimpses of all its previous victims preserved in its memory banks until the final moment. Alien cities with architecture that followed mathematical principles rather than aesthetic choices, crystalline forests that sang in harmonies that encoded fundamental constants of physics, vast machines built by civilizations that had achieved technological transcendence before being absorbed into something even greater. For a moment that seemed to last eternities, Darian thought he saw faces in the cosmic debris. Billions of individuals from countless worlds experiencing their last moments of independent existence before joining the creature's collective consciousness. Among them, he was almost certain he glimpsed his sister Rebecca, not as the sophisticated imitation that had called him from Sacramento, but as she had truly been, imperfect, chaotic, beautifully human in all her contradictions. The shockwave reached Earth 8 hours later, lighting up the sky with aurora displays that painted the atmosphere in colors that had no names in any human language. The electromagnetic pulse disrupted communications worldwide, but also served as a signal that the impossible had been accomplished through sheer desperate determination. Humanity had killed something that considered itself a god. Darian spent 4 days drifting in space before a rescue ship located his pod's emergency beacon. When he finally set foot on Earth again, barely alive from radiation exposure and oxygen deprivation, he found a world struggling to rebuild itself from the ashes of the greatest trauma in human history. The war was over, but its consequences would echo through generations. Half the population was gone, either killed in the fighting or consumed by the paranoia that had torn communities apart from within. Entire cities lay abandoned, their populations having fled to underground refuges that had become permanent settlements for people too traumatized to trust the surface world. The psychological damage cut deeper than physical destruction. Children had grown up learning to fear their own parents. Marriages had dissolved under the weight of constant suspicion. The social bonds that had defined human civilization for thousands of years had been strained beyond repair in many cases. But humanity had survived, and with survival came the slow, agonizing process of learning to trust again. Darian spent the following year documenting the aftermath, walking through cities that had become monuments to paranoia and loss. The memorials that rose in every settlement honored not just those killed by the creatures, but those destroyed by the fear they had created. Families that had cannibalized themselves through suspicion, communities that had imploded under the weight of existential uncertainty. The official casualty statistics would never capture the true cost of humanity's encounter with cosmic predation. How could numbers measure the death of innocence, the permanent loss of the assumption that the universe was fundamentally comprehensible? How could mathematics account for children who would never again look at the night sky without wondering what might be looking back? His appointment as director of the reformed United Nations Deep Space Monitoring Initiative came with a mandate that was both simple and terrifying. Watch for signs that other cosmic predators might be approaching Earth. What he discovered in those first months of systematic observation guaranteed that he would never sleep peacefully again. The evidence was scattered across dozens of star systems within humanity's observational range, dead worlds that had once hosted thriving technological civilizations but now drifted silent and lifeless through space. Radio telescopes detected faint signals that matched the harmonic patterns used by Mirror Earth, suggesting that more of the creatures remained active in distant regions of the galaxy. Most disturbing were the long-range sensor readings that indicated massive objects moving through interstellar space toward populated star systems. The trajectories were too precise to be natural, too purposeful to be anything other than artificially directed. According to the most optimistic calculations, at least 3 separate entities were currently en route to star systems that showed signs of developing technology. One of them was headed towards Sol. The reports he filed with the Security Council painted a picture of a galaxy where Earth's experience wasn't an anomaly, but merely the latest iteration in a cosmic hunting cycle that had been ongoing for millions of years. Somewhere in the darkness between stars, things that viewed entire civilizations as food sources were slowly making their way toward any world that demonstrated the capability for space-based observation. The public couldn't be told the complete truth. The psychological damage from the Mirror Earth incident had been severe enough without adding the knowledge that it represented merely the first of many such encounters. But in classified briefings, political and military leaders were quietly informed that Earth's victory had likely marked it as a target for even more dangerous entities. The creature they'd destroyed had been relatively unsophisticated in its methods, relying on brute force mimicry and direct infiltration. But intelligence analysis suggested that other cosmic predators might employ far more subtle strategies, gradual manipulation of human culture over centuries, careful genetic modification of the population through apparently beneficial medical interventions, or technologies that operated on principles beyond current scientific understanding. Humanity had won one battle against entities that considered themselves gods, but the war would never truly end. 3 years after Mirror Earth's destruction, the cultural transformation of human civilization was becoming evident, in ways both subtle and profound. art became obsessed with themes of authenticity and identity verification, as creators struggled to define what made humanity unique in a universe where perfect copies could be manufactured at will. Philosophy grappled with questions about the nature of individual consciousness and whether personal existence retained any meaning when confronted with cosmic intelligences that operated on galactic scales. Science fiction abandoned its optimistic visions of peaceful first contact, replaced by scenarios of infiltration and absorption by entities that viewed biological consciousness as raw material for processing. But perhaps most significantly, humanity itself was changing in response to the knowledge that they weren't alone in the universe. Survivors of the Mirror Earth incident displayed psychological adaptations that hadn't been observed in previous generations, enhanced pattern recognition abilities, improved detection of subtle behavioral anomalies, and what researchers termed adaptive paranoia that allowed them to function normally while maintaining constant awareness of potential threats. These traits were already appearing in children born after the war, suggesting that humanity was evolving in real time to meet challenges that their ancestors had never imagined. Whether this represented healthy adaptation or the beginning of a fundamental transformation in what it meant to be human remained an open question. Darian's final classified report, submitted exactly 5 years after Mirror Earth's destruction, contained recommendations that would reshape human civilization for centuries to come. Underground cities would be expanded into vast interconnected networks capable of sheltering the entire population during future attacks. All new construction would incorporate biological scanning systems and UV sterilization protocols as standard features. Most importantly, humanity would begin developing technologies designed not for exploration or expansion, but for concealment from entities that might be monitoring them from the darkness between stars. The old dream of reaching for the stars had been replaced by a new imperative, learning to hide from the things that lived among them. But as Darian stood for his final shift at the primary observation station, monitoring instruments designed to detect the approach of cosmic predators, he understood that humanity's greatest strength might also represent its greatest vulnerability. The same curiosity and determination that had led them to discover Mirror Earth would inevitably drive them to keep probing deeper into space, seeking answers to questions that might be better left unasked. The universe was vast and dark and filled with things that had been hunting for longer than human civilization had existed. But humans, being fundamentally human, would continue seeking knowledge anyway, regardless of the consequences. On his last night of observation duty, a new signal appeared on the long-range sensors. Subtle gravitational anomalies that suggested something massive was adjusting its course towards the Sol system. The trajectory calculations were preliminary, but the estimated arrival time was approximately 47 years. Enough time for one more generation to grow up believing they were safe. Darian's hand moved toward the emergency alert system as he prepared to inform humanity that their brief respite was ending. Somewhere in the cosmic dark, something else was approaching Earth with patient inevitability. The shooting star that crossed the sky at that moment moved with the two-straight trajectory that had become humanity's new definition of terror. As he watched it through the telescope, he could see that it wasn't burning up in the atmosphere like natural meteors should. Instead, it was decelerating. His finger pressed the alarm button as alarms began wailing throughout the facility. Humanity had learned to fight back once against entities that considered themselves gods. They would have to do it again, and again, and again, because in a universe filled with predators that operated on cosmic scales, the war would never truly end. The cosmos was patient and hungry and eternal. But so, it turned out, was humanity's refusal to surrender. The darkness between the stars held monsters that had been hunting since before Earth's sun was born, but it also held something they hadn't expected to encounter: a species too stubborn to accept extinction, too curious to stop learning, and too human to give up hope, even when hope seemed like the most dangerous luxury of all.